Catching every Pokemon is not a new idea. It's a challenge that people have done since the game's beginnings on the original Game Boy. It's the whole catchphrase of the series, gotta catch 'em all. But if you were like me when I was a kid, that sounded way too hard and maybe even a little boring. Simply having every single Pokemon, including every evolution, was a task my child brain was not ready for. With over 1,000 Pokemon, it might not be worth your time trying to catch them all. The way I grew up playing Pokemon was to get the cool ones, and then spam battles with my starting monster that knew 3 of the same kind of move. Kind of a small brain way to play the game. Sorry if I just described you. So skip to me around 15 years later. I'm finally understanding what stab moves mean, the difference between physical and special moves, and I'm actually looking at what abilities do. Yes, I know it took me a while. Anyway, getting on with the story, we're going back to the summer of 2022, after the launch of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and we're still in Generation 8. At the time, the Pokedex had amassed to 905 Pokemon, and I had already transferred quite a few Pokemon I had caught throughout my years of playing, but I wasn't working with too much. I'd seen videos of other people doing something similar, and I decided to be like that one guy in the YouTube comments. It's like, hey, I could do this too. But before I got to work, I decided to create some rules for myself. First, I wanted to catch everything myself and avoid trading as much as possible. I'll be real, this rule gets bent a little bit. Second, I wasn't going to use Pokemon Go, with the exception of Meltan, since it's like the only way to get him. Third, as a wise man once said,
never back down, never what? Never give up! That's right!
I was committed to seeing this to the end, so with these self-imposed rules, I set off on my journey to catch them all. Starting off with the few Pokemon I had already transferred from my childhood, in my boxes were some well-aged event Pokemon from back in the DS era. Old, but not forgotten, helping me reduce the need for any trading or replaying certain games. There is a little onion-shaped fella named Celebi, which is a mythical Pokemon, a step above legendary. Mythical Pokemon aren't easily obtained and are usually linked to some limited time event, but are sometimes obtainable elsewhere. For Celebi's case, I had obtained this one way back in 2011 in Pokemon Heart Gold, which according to the wiki was a GameStop giveaway, which I haven't really thought about in years. Fortunately at that time, I kept up with a lot of these events and received a few more mythicals like Keldeo and Victini in Pokemon White. At one point I had all the other Gen 5 mythicals, Meloetta and Genesect, but they were lost in the great tragedy known as resetting save data. Sorry guys. The good thing is, the ones I had lost did end up returning in later events and are now safely tucked into Pokemon Home to sit for, probably the rest of time. Look, they're hanging out. Now with a small fraction of the Pokedex out of the way, it's time to actually start playing the games. The first game I started in was Brilliant Diamond. Despite the game not being well loved by the community for its changes or lack of changes, the game was honestly a good place to start. It has everything from generations 1 through 4, and the overhaul to the underground made collecting starters much easier. Just playing through the game normally, you have access to a majority of the Sinnoh decks, but as I was nearing the end of my playthrough, I was getting around to catching Giratina, and in that moment I had the thought, but what if he was shiny though? 50 hours of resets later, and hey, would you look at that? The rest of my time spent playing the game was hanging out in the underground and catching the remaining Gen 1 through 3 Pokemon, and mining for the Rhombus Park materials. And goddamn, it's a lot of mining. The point of Rhombus Park is that it gives you access to a decent selection of older legendaries, but some of them are separated by the other game version, which for me was Shining Pearl. But that's when the hyperfixation kicks in. One whole playthrough the same game again, and I now had almost everything I needed in the first 4 generations. Catching Pokemon is normally a pretty simple and straightforward process, but of course they always throw in some gimmick that's heavily RNG dependent. Daily Swarm Pokemon is a mechanic that allows a pool of certain Pokemon to appear in the wild. One of these is Spinda. Spinda normally shouldn't be a problem. It's not a rare or hard to find Pokemon in any of the other games, but in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, this little bastard is a pain. It's incompatible with Pokemon Home, so you can't move one into or out of the game. So if you want to complete the Pokedex in this one, you need to catch them in a swarm. So you might ask, why not change the internal clock on the Switch to get a different daily Pokemon? And the unfortunate answer is that the developers are a bunch of assholes, and the game will automatically lock itself if it detects a change in the dates. I like integrity, but this kinda blows. After everything is said and done, finishing this game would mean I would have around just under 500 Pokemon. Now all I had to do was the event Pokemon, and like I said earlier, they are a limited time. I miss Darkrai. Fortunately for me, another Sinnoh-centric game had already come out. Pokémon Legends Arceus, a great change of pace from cookie-cutter gym battles into Elite Four. The game is definitely more focused on the catching aspect of the series, and ironically, this is probably the game I spent the least amount of time playing. There's only 6 new Pokemon this time around, but it did allow me to catch Darkrai just by doing a quest. The same can be said about the other event Pokemon, Shaman, and of course Arceus. He's literally in the name of the game, so that was promising. Before you catch Arceus, you have to complete the game's Pokedex. I didn't really document this process much at the time, but believe me, with my ultimate gamer prowess, this task was trivialized. So aside from the Pokemon I had already transferred, I would have around 499 Pokemon. Being over halfway through the challenge in a couple of games gave me a decent amount of confidence. There's only one other game I had left on the Switch, not that one. Pokémon Sword, infamous for not bringing back the National Dex. Although it did bring back a decent amount of the older Pokemon from across multiple generations, and added quite a few new ones. At this point in time, I had already completed the main story when it came out, but never got around to playing either of the DLCs. According to a quick Google search, this game contains about 800 Pokemon with the DLC included. So after casually going through each of the expansions, I now had free reign to run around and catch what I needed. All I really needed to do was catch at least one of the evolutions in a line, and then I could just put Ditto to work for the rest. The Crown Tundra expansion was kind enough to throw in a bunch of legendaries and all of the Ultra Beasts into the game. Unfortunately, it was at the cost of going through the max layer, which has the player run through a set of battles just for a shot to fight a boss Pokemon at random. This is useful for me because when it comes to the Ultra Beasts, I only own Pokemon Ultra Sun, so I'd be missing out on a few of the Ultra Beasts from Moon. But let me tell you, grinding this shit for hours can get boring. The max layer can be fun with friends, but I'm a strong independent gamer. I wasn't gonna wait for them. They also probably had better things to do. So for the time being, I decided to put off max layers and plan on returning when I was down to the last ones. Like always, there's still version exclusives in Shield. Fortunately, I have a friend who was nice enough to give me the version exclusives and the legendary Zamazenta. Huge time save, by the way. He was also nice enough to just sell me his copy of the game, so if I ever wanted to play the game again, I guess I could. Continuing to play the game, I ran into a few problems. The Crown Tundra had introduced 2 instances in which you had to pick between 2 Pokemon, and you could not receive the other without replaying the whole game. First you had Glastrier and Spectrier, then you had Regidrago and Regieleki. Now that I have a copy of Shield, I could make the poor financial decision and repurchase the DLCs and do it all over again, or just save myself time and money by just trading online. I folded. The hyperfixation was dying down, and only Adderall straight into the veins would get me to do it again. I also missed the event for Zarude, who hasn't come back in years, so I made the trade for him too. I know I said trading isn't in the spirit of the challenge, but I'd rather not wait another 5 years just for this monkey to show up. So with everything except the max layers done, it was time to move on again. I was down to less than 100 Pokemon left, and then they released Gen 9. Can't say Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are some of my favorite games in the series. They're ugly, they're laggy, and some of the characters are kinda uninteresting. I don't think this is a hot take or anything, but the gym leaders aren't even memorable in this one. What the game did provide though was an open world design, which I don't think was entirely necessary. Visible Pokemon on the overworld does make the process of running around and sniping these guys from their habitats much easier though. Like all the other games, it's easy to obtain most of the Pokemon through normal methods, but this time around, Game Freak decided to get freaky with the trend of weird evolution gimmicks. I hope you're ready for this segment. First you have Pawmot, a rodent creature that evolves when you take him out of his ball and run around 1,000 steps together, then you have to level him up. You can't really track your steps unless you count manually, so I just gave it a few minutes. I don't know who came up with this, and it doesn't get any better. Charcadet requires you to do a sort of side quest where you have to collect shards of a Bronzor or Sinistea to trade for an item which then allows you to evolve him into 2 different forms that are locked behind the 2 game versions. Fortunately, another friend of mine had Scarlet and was willing to trade me for his Armorogue. Armorogue? However you say it. Next is King Gambit, a new evolution to the Gen 5 Pokemon Bisharp, and to get him, you have to run around killing a bunch of posers while holding on to an item called the King's Crest, and then you have to level up, and only then will he become one of the most overpowered Pokemon in this generation. For the celebration of the 1000th Pokemon, they gave us Golden Go, which turns the game into a collectathon to get 999 coins to evolve him. So as you may be able to tell, this game was taking some time to complete. And of course Game Freak announced 2 DLCs for this game, meaning I would eventually have to return. That's okay, cause I still needed to get through some of the older games that predate the Switch, tidy up some loose ends. That's why I went to Pokemon Ultra Sun. The ultra thing about this game is it has a shit ton of Pokemon to catch. The not so ultra thing is I actually never played the game. So to get everything I needed, I had to play through the entire game. 30 something hours later and you get the idea. I filled the empty slots in my decks along the journey and eventually made it to the post game. One of the cool things about the box legendary in this game is it starts as Cosmog and evolves into Solgaleo or Lunala. So you get to see the progression of your little guy turn into a badass lion or bat. But if you think back to the challenge, you might realize that this is actually really fucking awful for me. The game was kind enough to give me a 2-for-1 deal on Cosmogs though, but that still leaves me with 2 more to go. But because of my gamer intuition, I already had this problem planned out. Pokemon Sword gives you a free Cosmog in the second DLC, so I had all I need for Solgaleo and the 2 baby forms, which leaves 1 more for Lunala. Fat spoiler incoming. The second DLC in Pokemon Violet will give you a Lunala already evolved. The rest of the time I spent playing Ultra Sun was going through wormholes trying to get the available Ultra Beasts. Now the only thing left for this game is all of the event Pokemon, Magearna, Marshadow, Zeraora. For whatever reason, you can still obtain Magearna through a QR code using the camera on the 3DS. And not too long ago, there was actually a Marshadow distribution event at Target stores in the US. But Zeraora was a bit different. The last event for Zeraora was in 2020, for a shiny one, and a regular Zeraora was last available back in 2018. So I'm about 6 years too late. Now this might be a bit controversial, but by non-conventional means, you can still obtain any event Pokemon without generating them legally. For a brief explanation, if you use hacks, you can just generate Pokemon through codes. So you could just give yourself the entire Pokedex if you wanted to. Generated Pokemon, if detected on Pokemon Home, can get your account banned. So instead of generating a Zeraora, you can use software to rerun any event onto your game, meaning that I can obtain an event legal Zeraora without the use of trading. Like I said, this counts as cheating, but I'd rather not wait another few years for an event to roll by again. On a side note, methods for rerunning events exist across all DS and 3DS games. So if you're in a similar spot as me, then I would suggest looking into it. With that said and done, Ultra Sun was ready to be set down, and I was ready to move on to the next game. For the final game on the DS, it was time for me to revisit the Unova region. I haven't played through these games from start to finish since it first came out, so I decided to take my time and enjoy myself for this one. I started out by resetting my save to obtain each of the starter Pokemon and actually just played through the game with an Oshawott, the same starter I picked way back. After my very relaxing playthrough of the game was over, it was time for me to catch the remaining Pokemon I needed. It was a Patrat and some monkeys. That's about it. For whatever reason, these guys haven't made the cut since they came out, so pour one out for the boys if it's one of your favorite Pokemon. If you have Pokemon Bank on your 3DS, it allows you to download a companion app called Poke-Transporter. The app pretty much just lets you transfer Pokemon from Black and White onto Bank, and then from Bank onto Home. It's a simple but tedious process when you take the time to do it. At this point in time, both of the DLC for Scarlet and Violet have been released, and I was getting a little lazy about finishing everything. So we're pretty much reaching the present, which is good, because that means I'm almost done. The DLC introduced a handful of new Pokemon, but mostly had returning Pokemon. About 90% of the new ones are pretty much handed to you if you just play through the story. But in the second DLC, the Indigo Disc, they introduced a few new Paradox Pokemon that can be obtained in Area 0. You have to do a scavenger hunt based off of some really ugly pictures, and then the Pokemon will just be sitting there waiting for you. I thought it was strange how the first set of Paradox Trios were in a raid event, but this time they kinda just threw them in as extra content. This is also sadly another instance where I had to hop on Reddit and ask people if they wanted to trade, so I could get Gouging Fire and Raging Bolt. But my decent selection of Pokemon had people asking to trade within a few minutes, so that was out of the way. The game also included an epilogue which takes a couple hours, and the character dialogue is kinda interesting. In the end, you get to catch the current final entry in the National Pokedex. As of now, Pecharunt. But with Pokemon ZA coming out, they're gonna release new Pokemon, so expect to hear from me soon. It was now time to truly finish this challenge and return to the max layer in Pokemon Sword. The cave had the remaining Ultra Beasts that were previously exclusive to Moon. Stakataka, Celesteela, Pheromosa. Those were the only things standing between me and finishing this challenge. And after a few hours, the RNG gods were in my favor. I caught a Stakataka and Celesteela off camera in my free time, but I knew when it came down to the last one, it needed to be recorded. And it pretty much just went like this. My journey was over. One for the books. More than a decade of my life was invested into this journey, and I was feeling a little proud of this accomplishment. Was I the fastest? Hell no. Was I the slowest? Possibly. Now, it was time to drop the remaining Pokemon into home and receive the last gift Game Freak has for trainers who complete their decks. A special colored Magarena, accompanied by a boring text box with no music that you can only claim on the mobile app. That's GG, I guess. Until next time, it seems. Now, if you know Pokemon, then you might call me out and say, hey, you didn't catch all the regional and variations of Pokemon. And to you, I say,
mission failed. We'll get them next time.
But this is something I'm aware of and I plan on doing. But just for today, we'll call it a victory. Thanks for watching the video. I'm going to do the whole YouTuber promo thing and ask you to consider liking the video and subscribing. I have plans for more content on the way playing other games, and of course more Pokemon videos too. I'd like to try doing this sometime on Twitch, live, so if you'd like to follow me on there too, I'll have a link to my channel in the description. This is a video I've thought about making for a while now, and I'm glad that I did it. But now that it's over, I'm excited to try out other challenges and things to do too, so I hope to see you around. Thank you again for watching.